Luxury beliefs are ideas and opinions that confer status on the elite while often inflicting costs on the lower classes. A core feature of a luxury belief is that the believer is sheltered from the consequences of his or her belief. I left for the Air Force when I was 17, did 2 enlistments. By the time I was 25, I got myself to a position where I could study at a place like Yale on the GI Bill, and I started to hear strange opinions from elite college students and graduates and professors that I'd never heard in my life. We need to abolish prisons and legalize all hard drugs, and later it became kind of defund the police. Family and marriage are unimportant, and we need to evolve beyond these patriarchal notions of what monogamy is and luxury beliefs. They make you look good while hurting people who are lower down the social hierarchy.
Well, welcome to Open Book. I am your host, Anthony Scaramucci. Joining us today is an incredible author. His name is Rob Henderson, and the title of the book is Troubled. It is a memoir of foster care, family, and social class. And what a great book. I mean, it was a pleasure to read, great to learn. I learned a lot of socioeconomic things are wrapped into that book, including your personal story. But and I also know Drew Pinsky very well. Dr. Drew and I were on the Special Forces show together a few years back, and so I've been on his radio show a few times. But let's start with you. Why write the book? And then let's talk about your name. My name is Robert Kim Henderson. You know, all three of those names are important to your life story. So let's start with you. Why write the book? And tell us who Robert Kim Henderson is. Hey everyone, it's Anthony Scaramucci here with some straight talk. Let me tell you, we've got 85% of our viewers who haven't hit the subscribe button yet. What's up with that? It hurts. Listen, I made my career by going all in. Right now, only 15% of our viewers are part of our subscribed family. So please take action. This helps us book more amazing guests. Hit subscribe, join our community, and let's turn these numbers upside down. Now back to the show.
Yeah, well, thanks, Anthony. Really great to be here. And I'm glad to hear that we have a mutual friend in Dr. Drew there. Well, I wrote this book in part to communicate to people segments of society that maybe not understand what's going on in foster care, in working class, blue-collar communities across the country. And yeah, my book can more or less be understood through the origins of my name, Robert Kim Henderson. So my first name, Robert, comes from my father, who I never met. The only information I have about him is his name from some documents from the social workers who were responsible for my case when I was in the foster care system in Los Angeles. And I was born in LA. My middle name comes from my birth mother, Kim. It was her name. She came to the US as a young woman, started studying, which is the reason why she moved to California, but then very quickly started to do drugs and make a lot of poor choices. And we were homeless for a time. We lived in a car. Eventually, we settled in this slum apartment in Westlake, which was kind of a rundown neighborhood at that point in the early 1990s. Eventually, some neighbors called the police. I was placed into the foster care system when I was 3 years old. And the police officers who came along with the social workers to take me into the system, they asked my mother, where's this boy's father? Because you're not in a position to care for him. And she said she didn't know who my father was. Although a couple of years ago, I did this 23andMe genetic ancestry test just to learn about that side of my family. So I knew my mom, she's Korean. I wondered, okay, well, I went my whole life just, kind of mixed race, Asian American, something like that. But I wanted to know, okay, well, what was that side of my family, my father's side? And the results of this 23andMe showed that I'm half Hispanic, so my father was Mexican. And, I read those results and I thought, well, it would have been nice to know that when I was applying for college. But, it ended up working out anyway. And so I spent 5 years in the foster system in Los Angeles, California, living in 7 different homes. I describe what those experiences were like in the early chapters of the book. Very difficult. kind of being torn from my mother and then moving to a different home every few months, different schools, different teachers, different foster siblings. One of the things that was hard, I mean, it wasn't just that I wouldn't know where I would go from, or where I would be living from week to week, month to month, but then sometimes I'd enter a foster home and befriend some of my foster siblings, and then I'd see them taken either to another home or returned to their family of origin. And so it was just, a lot of loss in my early life. And then eventually I was adopted by this couple, married couple. It was a man and a woman and their young daughter who became my adoptive sister. She was their biological daughter. And this was the Henderson family, and that's where my last name comes from. And so this was the late 90s. My adoptive family and I, we settled in this kind of dusty working class town in Northern California called Red Bluff, which is a part of California that most people are not familiar with. It's about 3 hours north of San Francisco, kind of close to the Oregon border. It's very rural, very red. I mean, I checked the statistics for the last presidential election, and it was something like 72% for Donald Trump in my county. It's one of the poorest counties in California, very run down. Very few adults have college degrees. So my adoptive father was a truck driver. My adoptive mother was an assistant social worker. And so for a temporary period of time, I had this intact family. But then, like so many other families in Red Bluff and so many other parts of the country, my family, my parents divorced. There were custody disputes and financial catastrophes and a lot of drama. So they separated. My adoptive father stopped speaking with me. And so I was raised temporarily by my adoptive mother as a single mom. And at this point, I was 9 years old. So I did what a lot of 9-year-old boys do when they're kind of unsupervised and raised by a single mom who's working overtime to make ends meet. And I made friends with a lot of other kind of troublemaking 9 and 10-year-old boys in my town. And, we would drink beer and tequila, and moved on to generic Vicodin and weed, and go to the local gas station and see how many cold medicine pills we could take before we started to feel funny, and kind of went on from there. There's a lot more to this, which we can get into if you like, but I'll just fast forward here and say, eventually I enlisted in the U.S. Air Force when I was 17, right out of high school, where I barely graduated. And with some hiccups and some missteps along the way, ended up going to Yale on the GI Bill, and then off to the University of Cambridge, and then on from there. But, the book is really, there are personal stories there about what I witnessed firsthand where I was growing up in the foster system, and then in this working class town. But there's, like you mentioned before, there's some research and some statistics and survey data on what's happening with kids who grew up in these communities, what their lives look like, what families look like in these communities too. And I think that family piece was one thing that Dr. Drew, that caught his interest, because he's been an advocate for families and youth for a long time. And he, saw a lot of this in his sort of personal practice and in his show. So that's the very short version of the story, but I'm happy to sort of delve into any part of that you like.
Well, listen, I appreciate you sharing. You share it beautifully in the book, but there are three big questions. I want to ask you all three before I end our show. The big three are, how do you do it, Rob? Because J.D. Vance looks like he did it. Right? He ended up going to Yale. He grew up in it looked like squalor. I don't know, people, he gets hit hard now. I'm not saying it's fair to him, whether the story's accurate or not. I believe that the story's funny. The story was accurate until he was running for president or vice president. Now the story's not accurate, but I'll take him at his word that the story is accurate. Your story is a beautiful story, but it's a painful story. There's tragedy in your story, and I guess where I want to go with the question is, how do you do it? How do you pull yourself? Look, I grew up in a blue collar neighborhood. I had two parents living in the house. They were dysfunctional. I was dysfunctional, but made it out of the neighborhood and rose and went to Ivy League schools and stuff. But you were further behind the eight ball than I ever could be. So how do you do it?
Yeah, it's a good question. And yeah, JD, he was very kind. He read my book. His wife Usha also read it, and he provided a very nice blurb for Troubled. And I have a great deal of respect and admiration for him. I read Hillbilly LG shortly
By the
after
way,
it came
I do
out, and
too. I mean, I'm
yeah,
not a Trump fan, as you know, but I,
yeah,
I I respect JD. I think he's a very very smart man, brilliant writer, and I
mm,
think he's capturing something about America that people need to hear. You are as
mm,
well.
mm,
But I'm just saying that your story, his story, these are very tough stories. What's
mm.
the X factor?
Yeah. Yeah, well, it's an interesting point there that you brought up about poverty and squalor because I grew up about as or I was born into a situation in which I was as poor as you could be in a first world developed country, but then if you spend time in actually poor countries, then you realize that things are just so much different. I've spent time in like Malaysia, for example, like parts of Southeast Asia where people literally live in wooden huts and their floors are made out of concrete. And I'm thinking to myself, well, I grew up poor, but nothing like this. There's to me, this is why I mentioned early in the book that yes, material factors are important, but there's something else going on here. There's a kind of a cultural and spiritual problem in addition to material poverty. Um, and so, what's the X factor? There's always that question, Anthony, of like nature versus nurture, and genes and environment. Is it how you're brought up? Is it role models? Is it environmental factors, or is there something within you intrinsically? I think it was a little bit of both. One thing that I point out in the book is that I was always kind of a bright and curious kid, but I was so weighed down by those early experiences that you can have a kid who has a lot of potential, who would be academically inclined and is smart, but if they don't have the right kind of stimulation and models and people around them who are sort of cultivating that latent ability, then the kid's never really going to manifest it. And I talk in the book about how when I was in second grade, so I was 7 years old, I was living in my final foster home, and I was doing so badly in school that the teachers and the social workers thought I might have had a learning disability. And so they sent this psychologist to the home to administer an IQ test for me. And I scored below average overall. And I scored way below average on the verbal section. And it wasn't because I was dumb. It was because no one taught me how to read, and because I was changing schools every 6 months. And there was no stability around me that would allow me to actually sit down and walk through the alphabet and how to spell out words and how to comprehend a story. And so, gradually over time, when I had periods of stability when I was a kid, shortly after the adoption, when I was raised by these two married parents for a time, my grades improved. I got third place in my school spelling bee. And then after the divorce, my grades plummeted again. And so, this isn't to say that every single kid, there's a hidden genius in them waiting to burst free if we just have the right sort of material conditions and family situations and everything. All I'm saying is that if you have a kid who is smart, you still need to have those factors in place for that to shine through.
But I mean,
Um,
are you your own Asian tiger mom?
no,
Because
I
I
wasn't. So,
feel like you are. I feel like you
uh,
beat the hell out of yourself almost to get yourself to where you are.
not during my childhood and my teen years. I
No,
talk
but
at length about the
you
book.
write
Yeah.
about it. It feels like a light went off in your teen years, and you were
Yeah.
like, "Okay, I'm getting out of this. I'm going to launder myself out of this situation." I feel like a light switched off. What I mean, switched on. What was there an epiphany? What was the moment where you said, "Hey, I'm moving"?
Yeah. Well, that was the other thing. The X factor is, this is another sort of environmental component here, is if I had stayed in Red Bluff when I graduated from high school the way that my friends did, where I grew up, the only way you get out of that town is you either go off to college or you join the military. I barely graduated. I was not in a position to go to college, but I went to the military, and that immediately transformed my environment. I wasn't around the same kinds of influences and the same kinds of peers and temptations. The military was such a suffocating structure where, here are the expectations, and if you fail to meet them, here are the consequences. Very cut and dried. You do X, this is what's going to happen. Y happens. Consequences and penalties were swift and immediate, and so were the rewards. You do XYZ and you get promoted. You do XYZ and you're going to get court-martialed. It's as simple as that. And so that was really helpful for me as a kind of aimless, undisciplined young kid, And I think at the time I resented this. When I was 17, 18 years old, shipping out for basic training in the early days, I actually didn't. I thought I had made a mistake initially. Like, man, this really sucks. Like all these rules, all these, all these people telling me what to do. I had a little bit of this rebelliousness kind of lingering from high school.
Of course, we
But
all
then
do.
over time, I realized my life started to improve. Physically, I felt better. Mentally, I felt better. I felt proud of myself. I saw the look in my adoptive mom's eyes when she would see me and she could notice that there was a change in me. My sister, like people around me respected me more and I carried myself in a different way. And once, it was not an immediate, oh, light bulb went off, my life is better now. It was more so gradually I started to pick up on these things such that, by the time I was in my early 20s, I started to realize like, oh, maybe I do have some potential. Maybe I can turn my life around and move forward and, improve myself, not just with the military, with the assistance of the military, but also kind of internally. And that's one of the things I point out is that I think a lot of people believe that if you want to be successful, you need to have motivation, or if you don't have motivation, you're not going to be successful. I need that motivation. But what the military taught me is that what's more important is self-discipline. That I'm going to do this regardless of how I feel. I don't feel motivated, I'm going to do it anyway. And initially that discipline was imposed from the top down, from this organization, this military structure that I was in, where I had to do something regardless of how I felt. But then gradually I learned to do that on my own, cultivating this internal discipline within myself of, I have all these things I have to do and I don't want to. Knock them out, do them anyway. And you string enough days like that together and eventually your life starts to change. And so that was a big lesson for me during those years.
Talk about luxury of beliefs. You coined this phrase. What are luxury beliefs? What does that mean?
Well, luxury beliefs are ideas and opinions that confer status on the elite while often inflicting costs on the lower classes. And a core feature of a luxury belief is that the believer is sheltered from the consequences of his or her belief. And I came up with this idea. The idea started to take shape in my mind when I arrived at Yale. So, I left for the Air Force when I was 17, did 2 enlistments. By the time I was 25, I, had gotten myself to a position where I could study at a place like Yale on the GI Bill. And I started to hear strange opinions from elite college students and graduates and professors that I'd never heard in my life, not where I grew up, not in the military. And suddenly I'm hearing that, we need to abolish prisons and legalize all hard drugs. And, later it became kind of defund the police. Family and marriage are unimportant. And we need to evolve beyond, these patriarchal notions of what monogamy is and all these kind of newfangled ideas. And so at that same time I was having those interactions and experiences, I was reading a lot about class and status and the history of social class in America and in other countries as well. And, for me, this idea, it starts really, you can trace it back to 1899, where this sociologist and economist Thorstein Veblen wrote this book, The Theory of the Leisure Class. And Veblen pointed out in his day, the elites would exhibit their status with material possessions, with luxury goods, expensive tuxedos and top hats and evening gowns and pocket watches, monocles, and they would, show off these what they were wearing as badges of their social status. And then if you fast forward to the mid 20th century, sociologists, Pierre Bourdieu and others, they pointed out that a lot of elites would convert their economic capital, their money, into cultural capital or sort of expressions of their status. They would perform their status through the kinds of opinions that they had, the tastes that they had acquired. And at that point in the mid 20th century, it was like arcane and intricate knowledge about like wine and art and exotic locales, information that you would only have access to if you were educated at the right schools and had access to kind of, I hate this word, but like privileged sources of information that only people with money and status could acquire. And so my claim is that luxury beliefs are the latest manifestation of cultural capital. Luxury goods are status, or luxury beliefs are status symbols. And so in the book, I go through different beliefs and point out that a lot of these beliefs, like, for example, defund the police, there were surveys conducted in 2020 and 2021, which consistently found that the highest income Americans were the most in support of defunding the police, and the lowest income Americans were the least in support of it. You know, if you break it down by political orientation, white progressives were always the most in support of defunding the police, and Black and Hispanic Americans were always the least in support of it. And yet that became a popular, fashionable view for a time among our elite and our cultural tastemakers. And who suffers? It was poor and marginalized people, the very people that these elites claim to be wanting to help them, and wanting to champion these people and mitigate their plight. And instead, they're often making things worse. And we could go through different luxury beliefs if you like, but that's kind of the core of the idea, is that luxury beliefs, they make you look good while hurting people who are lower down the social hierarchy.
I think it's a brilliant concept, and I'm going to add it to my personal lexicon. We took 5 words out of your book, and I'm going to read you the word. And when I say the word, I want you to come back to me with something, a thought. Okay, so if I say the word family to Rob Kim Henderson, what do you say?
Well, am I supposed to give one word answer back?
Well, you can give me a sentence, a word, a sentence, something you think about.
Well, I think stability.
Stability.
Yeah. I mean,
what if I say?
That,
go ahead. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, if we're a lot of people across the political spectrum, they claim to care a lot about inequality and social mobility, particularly on the left. You hear a lot about inequality, but one of the things that Melissa Carney points out in her book, The Two-Parent Privilege, is that the number one predictor of a child going on to graduate from college is being raised by 2 married parents. Mm-hmm. And so that is what comes to mind when I think of family.
Mm-hmm. All right. How about I say the word class?
It's complicated. It's not the same thing as money. There's a great book on class by Paul Fussell where he points out, class really comprises 3 different components. Money, but money is not enough to kind of rise in social class. If you win the lottery, you don't suddenly join the upper class. There's money, then there's education. Were you sort of educated in the right places, and do you move in the right circles? And then finally, there's cultural capital. Do you have the right opinions? Do you know how to get by in these different communities?
All right, well said. What if I say the word luxury?
Luxury beliefs. It's expressions of status.
Okay. How about the word troubled?
Yeah, I think of children and families. A lot of kids, a lot of families are in difficult circumstances.
Yeah, I think of the word pain. After reading your book, if I hear the word troubled, I think of the word, there's pain in the word troubled. Yeah.
Yeah. It was initially so painful that I almost wanted to give the book a different title, but I thought that was the most honest one. So I went with that.
Oh, those are a great title. It's a great book. Okay, last word, and I'm going to give you the last word. And it's 2 words, Rob Henderson.
Wow. What comes to mind is transformation. I went through a lot of different shifts and periods, and there were a lot of reversals in my life, and I had to change myself, not because I wanted to, but because I had to. And I think a lot of people, surprisingly, a lot of readers write to me saying that they related to the book, which it shocks me, because I thought this story was, it's kind of peculiar. Most people don't know about the foster system. Most people don't, they don't go to these highly selective schools, and they don't have contact with these different parts of our society. But people still felt, everyone on some level has to change and adapt and move forward in their lives at some point or another.
Well, you're a brilliant guy. You've written a phenomenal book. The title of the book is Troubled. It's a memoir of foster care, family, and social classes. So much content in here. I just want to thank you for writing the book, and I'm very grateful to have you on our show today.
Thank you, Anthony. It's been an honor.
I had a guy who grew up in several foster homes. His name was Rob Henderson,
Right.
and he grew up incredibly poor,
Right.
and he made it to Yale University, and he's super successful. Do we know a lot of stories like that?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. I can't say who, but I know someone that has worked around the clock who did not have much because the mother was not an even keel person. And because she was an even keel, she used to spend money on 37 pocketbooks.
Mhm.
And that made him very aggressive, and he works very, very hard and long hours to make it.
But that can happen. But that can happen in America, right? Isn't that the beauty of America, Ma?
Of course, that's American for
Right.
sure.
Right. You can start with
Absolutely.
little to no money and make a lot of money if you're willing to hustle and have some integrity, right?
But if they have a little bit of help from someone that's very kind, without saying names, that gives them the start and the ambition to do that. But you have to have the brain to want to do it, though, too. I mean,
Right.
God bless. You have to have the brain
Well,
to want to do
this kid definitely had the brain. I really admire what he
it.
did.
Of course. You're
right.
a pretty good example. You came from a middle-class family, and you ended up in Harvard, and you have millions. Or billions,
All right, Ma.
whatever the
You
hell.
you don't want to give up my net worth here on the show, do you?
No, but I wouldn't mind having a little bit of it.
Oh yeah, and but you like your Maserati though, right?
I love my Maserati.
Maybe I got the nickname Mooch because of you. You want to mooch off some of my money?
I am mooching off your money because Dad didn't leave me any money.
All right.
I am mooching off your money.
Okay, Ma. All right, Ma. Let's not expose all the family's dysfunction to all these wonderful listeners, okay?
Well,
Let's keep the word fun and the word dysfunctional.
I had a very savvy, I had two brothers. One was a saint, one was edgy. And my brother that was savvy used to say to me, you have to keep some of it to yourself, because the ones that tell you their life is perfect, that means their life is not perfect, because they wouldn't have to tell you about it.
Yeah, right. Of course. I mean, that's why I try to keep.
Every family has something. Yeah. That some people are smarter than me. I had exposed everything, but some people are smarter than me, and they hold it back.
100%. Totally agree with you.
Thank you.
All right. I love you, Ma. Thank you for joining.
Love you too.
All right.
Thank you for having me.
Okay. Love you, Ma. All right.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Hey, thank you for watching this episode. If you enjoyed this episode, here's another one right up here that you might like. So joining me today on Open Book is Professor Chris Miller. He's an associate professor of international history at the Fletcher School at Tufts University and the author of a best-selling book. I think the FT also said probably the best book of the year, Chip War. I'll hold it up here, Chris. The Fight for the World's Most Critical Technology. And before we got started, I was telling Professor Miller that I read this in one session, primarily because I saw my entire future unfolding before me, Chris, okay, because there's a lot in here, and whether people like it or not, what you're writing about, they're relying on in their lives. So much of this technology now is embedded in every part of our lives, whether it's our medicine and healthcare, our telecommunications, the way we interact with each other in business. But let's go to Tufts for a second. You probably know I'm a jumbo. How long have you been teaching at Tufts? How did you get to Tufts? And considering your previous books, how did you get interested in this field, the chip field?
Well, I've been teaching at Tufts for 6 years now, and my background is in Russian history, which, as you say, is not the most natural background for writing about semiconductors. But I started around 6 or 7 years ago planning to write a book on the evolution of defense technology during the Cold War. And the question I wanted to understand was, why was it that during the Cold War, in the early stages, both the US and the Soviet Union could produce the key weapon systems, nuclear weapons, long-range missile systems. By the end of the Cold War, it was only the US that could produce the types of precision strike systems that the US dominates today. And I thought that'd be a story just about missile systems or fighter jets, but it turns out it was a story of computing power, which the US applied to all sorts of defense systems. And I quickly realized that it wasn't just the military that had been transformed by computing power. It was everything, because today it's hard to find a device that doesn't have at least one and often dozens or hundreds of semiconductors inside.
So I want to ask one question about the Russian situation first. Why did you get into Russian history? What fascinated you there?
It was just sort of by chance. I studied it as an undergrad, was fascinated by how different the society was, wanted to understand what made the country tick. And it is so different from the U.S. It struck me as an interesting place to study and to better understand the comparisons and the contrast between the U.S. and Russia.
So, I've only been to Russia once. I took a semester away from Tufts and went to the London School of Economics. I spent 5 days in Russia in March of 1985. This is when Chernenko had just died. Gorbachev was rising to power. And again, I don't have a lot of consequential intersections with the Russians, but one thing that struck me was one of the tourists. I was on an in-tourist, you probably remember that agency that took you around, and obviously they spied on you the whole time. But what the woman said to me was that they're halfway in Asia and halfway in Europe, and therefore in no place, meaning they don't feel culturally attached to either. And so even though it's the largest landmass in the world controlled by one sovereign, they sort of feel like they're not connected to either place, which has probably wounded their pride maybe, or has done something to affect the culture there. What do you think of that observation by an in-tourist tour guide 35 years ago or 37 years ago? And how do you think that's impacted the culture?
I think you're right. I think if you look at the Russian war with Ukraine right now, you see that playing out in action. On the one hand, Russia feels itself not part of Europe in conflict with the West. On the other hand, if you look at Russia's relations with China, the Russians they have to be friends with China today because they have no other option, but they're really deeply concerned about, in the long run, are they putting themselves in a position of being a second tier power with China, the more dominant country. And I think that that's a dynamic that's been reflected throughout Russian history, this sort of pendulum swinging back and forth between Russia aligning itself with China, aligning itself with the West, back and forth, never feeling itself really at home in either part of the world.
Well, correct me if I'm wrong. There's a 1,500 mile or so piece of landmass that the Chinese feel was taken from them by the Russian government in the 1630s, and they feel like that's their rightful ownership. And so there is some tension about a large piece of land bordering China. Is that not right?
That's right. There are centuries-old territorial disagreements. I think, though, I wouldn't overestimate the territorial question. A lot of Russians are actually concerned about, does China want to take their land? The reality is that there's not much of an economy in most of Siberia. Such economy as there is involves drilling oil or digging for minerals which are already shipped to China. China has already complete access to Russia's mineral wealth. And so there's actually not a whole lot of logic for China to really try to take back territory because it's got free access right now. And one of the aspects of the war between Russia and Ukraine that has been underappreciated in the West is the extent to which, because of the war and because of Western sanctions, China's got privileged access now to Russian minerals because Russia can't sell them to anyone else. So for China, it's been a pretty good financial deal because they get cut price access to some of the world's greatest mineral deposits.
Okay, let's go to the book. This book is fascinating. The fight for the world's most critical technology. I have young viewers and listeners on this podcast. So let's start with the most basic question, Chris. What is a microchip?
So, microchip or semiconductors is also known as a piece of silicon, often the size of your fingernail, sometimes larger, with thousands or millions, or today often billions of tiny circuits carved into them. And these circuits are turned on and off by a device called a transistor. When a circuit's on, it produces a 1. When it's off, it produces a 0. And all of the ones and zeros undergirding all computing are these microscopic circuits flipping on and off.
And so those processes, which are basically operating in a binary system, 0, 1, 0, 1, those processes are able to do tons of different computations, tons of different algorithms, tons of different software commands, okay, that can light up your refrigerator and dial your refrigerator into the right temperature. It can help you access the internet from your phone, your car. It can uplink you to a satellite so you can get a GPS system in the car and take you precisely to the location that you're looking at. It has the ability to allow computers to talk to each other as well. And so there's a multitude of different things that are going on, including our power grid. In fact, I don't think I can name anything, Professor Miller, that does not involve at this point a semiconductor chip, if it's something to do with the interoperability or the interaction between human beings. Am I right about that?
Yeah, that is right. Today, basically everything with an on-off switch has at least one and often hundreds of chips inside. And I think most people struggle to realize this because you've never bought a single chip in your life. In most cases, you buy chips embedded in the products that you acquire. You never see the chips inside of them. And so most people don't really realize just how dependent they are on semiconductors and how they rely on not just hundreds, but thousands and thousands of semiconductors to make their daily lives work.
So to really date myself, because I'm closing in on 100, I mean, I'm closer to 100 than I am to 0. Professor Paul Kennedy was all the rage when I was in college. He written a book called The Rise and Fall of the Great Powers. He's a Yale professor. It was a book that scared the Reagan administration and talked about America's decline. And we can debate whether or not America is declining or other nations are rising or some combination of the both. But what I found fascinating about your book is that there's only 4 or 5 countries. Let me read them. Okay, tell me if I have them right. Okay, right out of your book: United States, the Netherlands, Germany, the UK, Japan, Taiwan, and Korea are basically the major manufacturing centers for these semiconductors. So weirdly, they're technological superpowers, are they not? I mean, they're controlling the keys to everything. If their foundries or factories are eliminated, it would cause a international crisis and probably a global recession. Do I have that right, sir?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And we talk about globalization, and the market for selling chips is global. You can buy a smartphone anywhere in the world, but the production of them is not global. It's hugely concentrated. And so if you look, for example, at the production of advanced processor chips, the type of chips that go inside of smartphones or PCs or data centers, 90% of the most advanced processor chips can only be produced by one company on one island, and that's Taiwan. And there's just no other part of the global economy that comes anywhere close to that level of concentration. I like to make the comparison with oil. Saudi Arabia produces less than 15% of the world's oil. Taiwan produces 90% of the world's most advanced chips.
So what do you think happened there in terms of U.S. policy? We're not stupid people. We led to the rise of the Silicon Valley. We put venture capital taxation in place, long and short-term capital gains to create capital flow into innovation. We did so many smart things in our country, but glaringly over the last 3 decades, we're relying on the island of Formosa and the Republic of Taiwan, which is in a tenuous situation. So just to remind all of our listeners, Taiwan for Greater China, mainland China, is considered part of China. Of course, the Taiwanese government doesn't believe that, and they want to have their own sovereign nation. But the United States is torn and has to accept this sort of 2 systems, 1 country sort of approach, if you will. I mean, there's a better vernacular for it. You probably know it better than me because you're at the Fletcher School. But the point being, Taiwan seems to be under threat from mainland China since Chairman Mao, the founder of Communist Chinese Party, or at least the one that took over in 1948, the mainland, they want that island back. And we have 90% of the semiconductors being produced out of our island. So where did we get this wrong from a policy perspective? There's nobody in our national security complex at this point would say, okay, yeah, that was a really good move to have 90% of the semiconductors, the most important semiconductors, manufactured there.
I think there were two trends that intersected simultaneously. One was that TSMC, the Taiwanese chip maker that towers above everyone else in the industry, really grew dramatically over the last 15 years. It was a company that put itself at the center of the smartphone industry, and then now it's at the center of producing the chips that power AI. And so it's grown from a medium-sized company 15 years ago to an absolutely central player in the world's tech ecosystem. And it did that by producing very high quality, cost-efficient chips. And so the Silicon Valley companies that produce their chips at TSMC, so Apple, Google, Facebook, and many others, they've been very happy with TSMC playing this central role because they've gotten the components that they've needed. And so there's no one in Silicon Valley that's saw this as problematic. As this has happened, the U.S. ability to defend Taiwan has, I think, deteriorated because China's military power has grown and grown and grown each year. If you go back to the 1990s, the Chinese would have been deeply afraid to threaten Taiwan because it was obvious if there was a war, who would win. You can think back to 1996 when there was a crisis in the Taiwan Straits. The Chinese shot some missiles through Taiwanese airspace, and President Clinton at the time ordered an aircraft carrier to sail through the Taiwan Straits, and the Chinese stood down. And today, I think any U.S. president would be very hesitant to take such a move because China's military is so much more powerful today. And there really wasn't anyone putting together the pieces, looking at these two trends simultaneously. Defense officials knew the military balance was changing. People in the tech world knew that Taiwan was becoming more and more important for semiconductors, but no one was looking at these two trends simultaneously. And it wasn't really until the pandemic when most people woke up and said, wow, this is extraordinary concentration, and it happens to be in a geopolitical hotspot.
So no one knows the answer to this, Professor Miller, but let me ask you this and get your opinion at least. The fact that 90% of these semiconductors are being made in Taiwan, does that make it more or less likely that the Chinese will make a move to reacquire the Taiwan or the island of Formosa?
Well, I think there are some people who say surely the Chinese would want to attack Taiwan now to get a hold of the chip-making facilities. And it's just not that simple because Taiwan's chip-making facilities only work by importing all sorts of chemicals and components and software tools from Japan, from the US, from Europe. And so if there were a Chinese takeover, the facilities would stop working. And moreover, you need the people involved too. It's the engineers who work at the facility that make the facilities actually function. And so if they were to leave, again, the facilities wouldn't be worth all that much. So it's not so simple to say China's going to march in and take over the chip making facilities.
Yeah, well,
but,
I mean, I'm sorry. Go ahead. Keep going. No, please.
Yeah, no. I think, but it's certainly the case that the Chinese government is unhappy about the fact that over the last couple of years, the U.S. has been leaning on Taiwan to stop selling China cutting edge chips. And today, if you look at U.S. export controls that ban the transfer of certain types of chips to China, many of these export controls target chips that are designed in the U.S. but manufactured in Taiwan. And so there are plenty of voices in China who blame Taiwan for going along with U.S. export controls and use that as a justification for escalating tensions.
I guess the ancillary question would be maybe they would wait until we repatriated those foundries and moved them back to the United States, reshored them, if you will, or put them somewhere else, because it is of too much national interest and national consequence for the U.S. at this point. And if that was no longer the case, it may be easier from a national interest perspective and the balancing of national interests for the Chinese and the American government. What do you say about that?
Well, I think over the next decade, there's no chance that we repatriate a substantial share of the cutting edge chip making capacity in Taiwan. We're going to repatriate some of it. TSMC is building some facilities in Arizona. Samsung is doing the same. Intel is doing the same. But the reality is there's so much capacity in Taiwan, and they're investing so much more year after year that they're going to remain an absolutely critical player for many years to come.
So, you have a couple of characters in this book. The book is fascinating, by the way, and you're a great writer. So I'm going to name these characters. I want you to react to their personalities and who they are in your book. Let's start with Morris Chang.
Well, I think Morris Chang is one of the most underestimated entrepreneurs of the last 100 years. People know Bill Gates and Steve Jobs, but it's Morris Chang that produced the chips that all of us rely on. In your iPhone, there's chips that Morris Chang's company makes, and the data centers that process your data in your car as well. He's a fascinating character because he spent most of his life actually in the U.S., most of his professional career in the U.S., and moved to Taiwan to found TSMC only after being passed over for the CEO job of Texas Instruments, where he'd worked for a long time.
It's an amazing story. And he took one of my friends, Bill Ty, with him. Bill's very proud of his, I think he's employee number 1, 2, or 3 of TSM, Taiwan Semiconductor. So Morris is obviously a fascinating guy. Let's go to Gordon Moore.
Gordon Moore, who just passed away earlier this year, was one of the co-founders of Intel and coined the phrase Moore's Law, which predicted that the number of transistors per semiconductor, and therefore the processing power of each chip, would double every 2 years. And that's remained the case for now over half a century.
Is it still going to remain the case, or will it eventually get to the end of that replication?
Well, eventually we'll get to the end, but we've got a pretty clear line of sight for at least 10 more years of Moore's Law doubling. Beyond that, it's impossible to say.
So stuff's going to get way faster, way more complex. The artificial intelligence, the ideas behind it will be passing through faster processing chips and faster speeds. And again, if it's doubling every year, it'll be exponential 10 years from now. Is that not fair to say?
That's absolutely right. And compare that to any other sector of the economy. Nothing else doubles over many decades. I like to use the analogy of just imagine if airplanes flew twice as fast every 2 years. At this point, we'd be many times faster than the speed of light. That's actually happened in chip making. They've doubled for so many decades that we've now got a billion-fold increase in computing power relative to the first chips that were produced in the late 1950s.
The very fact that you and I are talking over this computer to each other like George Jetson would have been doing in the 1960s in a cartoon is an example of that, right?
Yeah, that's right.
Let's go to the U.S.-China rivalry for a second. The U.S. is trying to restrain China's technological growth, and the Chinese obviously want to domesticate their chip production. So all of this you spell out in the book. For our listeners' sake, tell us how the United States is trying to restrain the Chinese and what materials are no longer supplying to them, and how are the Chinese retaliating, and who do you think wins that or doesn't win that? What do you think the outcome will be?
Well, right now, basically every chip making facility in the world has machine tools from just a couple of countries. The US, Japan, and the Netherlands are the 3 most important. Whether it's a facility in Europe or Japan or China, you basically need to buy tools from these 3 countries. And that's been part of China's strategy over the last several decades, is buy lots of tools from these companies and use it to build up manufacturing capabilities. And what the US, as well as Japan and the Netherlands, have done over the past half a year is restrict China's access to cutting edge chip making tools, with the aim of stopping China from producing cutting edge chips. And right now, China's already several generations behind what can be produced in Taiwan, for example. And without access to these tools, which are some of the most precise and complex and expensive tools ever made, China will find itself struggling even more to catch up.
Okay, one last character involved here. Okay, Secretary William Perry, former Secretary of Defense during the Clinton administration. Tell us about him.
Perry's really an extraordinary figure. He was a Silicon Valley entrepreneur, but he was focused on defense technology and intelligence technology. And so he was someone who stood at the intersection of all of the extraordinary changes happening in Silicon Valley, but also thought about what were the national security implications. And he first went to the Pentagon as an undersecretary for research and engineering in the late 1970s, and was the person more than anyone else responsible for convincing the Pentagon to bet very heavily on computerized weapon systems, because he realized that Moore's Law was happening, that it would continue for some time, and that it gave the U.S. an extraordinary advantage, not just in commercial technology, but also in military systems.
Back to China, though. Secretary Perry is very worried about the Chinese. He speaks regularly about it on CNN. So I want you to brief me. You're the National Security Advisor to the United States, and you're going to send a briefing memo to the president. And so we're working on it together. What are you going to put in that memo?
Well, I think the Chinese want access to advanced semiconductors because they realize that advanced chips are critical for training artificial intelligence systems. And the fact of the matter is that today you can't train an advanced AI system like any of OpenAI's GPT systems without access to a tiny number of chips called GPUs, which are produced almost exclusively by American companies. These are the chips that China most wants because of their AI relevance. And that's exactly why the U.S. is trying to stop China from acquiring these chips so that the U.S. can keep an advantage vis-a-vis China when it comes to AI.
Are we ahead or behind the Chinese when it comes to AI?
Well, it's a hard question to measure. It's hard to know what you would measure. You can look, for example, at who's got the most widely cited AI scientists. There, the U.S. is far ahead. You can try to measure who's got the most advanced research in AI, but it's actually hard quantitatively to know who's got more capabilities there. I think, though, it's not a coincidence that OpenAI was founded in the U.S. and not in China. When you look at the commercialization of AI, what you find is that I think the U.S. is far ahead of what you've got in mainland China.
So again, I'm going back to our brief. You and I are working on this for the American president. How do you feel about the Chinese right now? Are they? Let me speak as a person that has, has some knowledge of China, or at least their point of view. They're not a threat to anybody. They would say they're focused on their region, and they're not a group of people over 5,000 years that have generally attacked other people. I'm not saying there aren't instances where they've done that, but in general, they don't see themselves as hegemonic as much as they see themselves as an inward country building. And so they don't feel that they're a threat to anybody. But do you feel that they're a threat to anybody?
Well, I think as you said in the early portion of our conversation, they certainly are a threat to Taiwan. And the Chinese have a law on the books that commits themselves to either, quote, peaceful or, quote, non-peaceful reunification, which is about as explicit a military threat as you can get. And that matters for this AI discussion because militaries are thinking very seriously about how can you apply artificial intelligence and autonomous systems to military and intelligence use cases. We're already seeing in the Russia-Ukraine war the earliest iterations of this, and there's no doubt that in 10 years' time, the world's militaries will rely more and more on AI. And so the question of who can apply these technologies to defense systems first is going to shape the balance of military power.
Okay, let me put my Chinese hat on for a second, though. Okay, that is our territory, and we never gave up the fight after 1948. That is still our territory. And by the way, our patience being quite a virtue, we were able to reacquire Hong Kong peacefully in 1997, and we intend to do the same thing with Taiwan. Why is it different, Professor Miller?
Well, there's hardly anyone in Taiwan that wants to be, quote unquote, reunified with China. So there's no pathway to do it peacefully because the Taiwanese don't want it. So when the Chinese talk about, quote unquote, reunification, and remember, they haven't actually, Taiwan has actually historically not been part of China. It's been ruled by all sorts of different empires, and China hasn't ruled Taiwan for over 100 years. But when you talk about, quote unquote, reunification in China, there's no way to do that other than via threatening force because the Taiwanese don't want it. And so I think we shouldn't take seriously the claim that China is just looking to find some sort of pathway for peaceful reunification because that pathway doesn't exist. And all of the polls you get out of Taiwan demonstrate very clearly, very, very clearly that there's no constituency whatsoever for that type of policy. And you mentioned Hong Kong and the Chinese takeover of Hong Kong provided plenty of evidence for people in Taiwan as to exactly why they didn't want that.
Okay, it means an excellent summary of things that are going on, Chris, and I appreciate it. In finishing your book, when I closed it, I said to myself, okay, what would be the policy recommendations here for the American government? So tell me what yours would be. I can tell you what mine are, but mine are going to be less interesting than yours.
Well, I think the key challenge the U.S. faces is that building semiconductors in the U.S. is just a lot more expensive than other parts of the world. 20, 30, 40% more expensive to build in the U.S. than to build in Taiwan or Korea. And partly that's due to tax policy. Because semiconductor manufacturing is so capital intensive, tax treatment of capital expenditure is a huge input. And so we've actually made some progress. The CHIPS Act provides a new investment tax credit that goes a long way to equalizing the tax treatment of chip investment in the US versus in Korea or Taiwan. But there are other factors, land costs, labor costs, and others that drive up the cost of chip making in the US. And so I think what we've got to do more of is driving down those factors that create cost differential. And if you look at permitting, for example, it requires more permits that take more time to build a chip making facility in the US than in Europe. Which is, I think a pretty bad benchmark by which to measure yourself against. And so that explains a lot of the cost differential that's made it less attractive to build semiconductors in the U.S.
So you have written about Russia as well. A couple books on Russia, I believe 3. Got to get to those. I haven't read those yet, frankly, but this one was fascinating. So I'm going to go read your other books. But in reading about you, okay, you write about this complex track record that the Russians have when it comes to technology, and they've had some successes. We know that in rocketry and things like that. But where do you think the Russians are as it relates to advanced semiconductor technology? And of course, in light of the recent sanctions that have been put on them as a result of the Ukrainian war.
They're miles behind right now. And we know this because the Ukrainians have actually captured a lot of Russian military equipment on the battlefield. And there's been great studies opening up those systems, examining the semiconductors inside. And they're all smuggled in from the West, from the US, from Europe, from Japan, from Korea, from Taiwan. So the entire defense industrial base in Russia is actually built on Western semiconductors.
You know who Professor Mackinder is, right? You're a Russian expert, right? So he wrote to the West that he was concerned that the Eurasian landmass being the most important landmass in the world, that if any superpower or a conjoinment of two superpowers took over the Eurasian landmass, and that's mostly Russia and China, that would have disastrous consequences on the West. Do you agree with him? Number one, obviously he wrote that in the 1850s. It's interesting because it's 200 years later. Do you agree with him? Number one. And number two, if you do agree with him, where do you think we are in terms of the potential team up of Russia and China?
I think there's no doubt that the Russia-China partnership is as close as it's been in many decades. It's not just that Russia and China see eye to eye on their desire to confront the U.S. It's that Putin and Xi personally are quite close. They celebrate their birthdays together, for example. So they've got a really strong personal relationship. And that is very clearly a threat and a challenge to the United States. And the one thing they agree the most on is that they want to bring down U.S. power and create more space for themselves. But I think if you look at Eurasia, certainly geographically, they're the two biggest powers, but they're far from alone. India, a hugely important player in Eurasia, and by some metrics, even more important than Russia, for economic metrics, for example. And then when Mackinder was talking about Eurasia, he was putting Europe in that category too. And of course, the Russians have lost all of Europe. Europe's more united against Russia than it's been at any point since the Cold War. And so in that sense, I think the Russian-Chinese alliance or entente today is actually a less impressive alliance in terms of the power it can bring to bear than perhaps in Mackinder's day.
Well, I think what's fascinating, I had obviously a very famous short stint in the government, but when you read enough about what we're doing from a policy perspective as an insider, you realize the complexity. So the Chinese want to reduce our power, but they don't want to completely crush us because they need our consumption. They are basically the Saudi Arabia of manufacturing, and all of that stuff that's coming into the Walmart or the Target, if you will, the Target, being bought by the American consumer is helping their economy. So they can't overly crush us, right? Flip side, we can't overly crush them because we're reliant on them for so many other things. So there's this weird rivalry. It's not like sports. Well, okay, let's pummel the other team into the ground and take the Super Bowl. We're too globally interdependent. Am I right about that is question number one. And then question number two, if I am right about that, make a prediction for me, Professor Miller. What do you think happens?
I think you're right that there's interdependence between the U.S. and China, but I also think that the political drivers and the security drivers of the relationship have been pushing economics in ways that wouldn't have otherwise gone. The tech restrictions, the new restrictions on capital flows, these are changes that they're coming from the security focused aspects of the government, and they're beginning to change the structure of the economic relationship between the U.S. and China. And so I think we shouldn't underestimate the extent to which the security rivalry will continue shaping the economic relationship. And you can look at, for example, the trade volumes between the U.S. and China. But I think in some ways that's actually a lagging indicator of decisions that were made 5 or 10 years ago being borne out today. And when you look at investment flows now, what you find is that FDI into China has fallen dramatically, and basically every multinational company in the US and Japan and Korea and Taiwan, they're all looking to diversify and reduce their reliance on China. And so I think the economic relationship will actually change dramatically over the coming years, precisely due to these political and security concerns.
Are you bullish on the United States?
I am, yes. I think if you look at just the last couple of years of technological progress compared to anywhere else in the world, you'd much rather be an investor or a beneficiary in U.S. progress.
Yeah, no, I asked that question because I actually knew the answer. I knew what your answer was going to be. And it's interesting because a lot of people are negative or sour on the country right now. They don't understand that relatively we're quite well positioned, but also culturally we're well positioned, right? I mean, we have this incredible culture of entrepreneurship and risk taking and innovation, and we're coming up with new things ahead of these other people. So why do you think that is?
I think if you look at the history of the tech sector, you get a couple good reasons why. One is that you have the best and the brightest people from all over the world coming to places like Silicon Valley to start up businesses. Look at NVIDIA, for example, a company that just passed the $1 trillion mark because of its ability to produce the chips that power AI systems, founded by an immigrant from Taiwan, actually, who had this visionary view of how to make chips for AI. I think the second aspect is U.S. capital markets have been very, very good at putting resources towards the most innovative ideas and doing so in the most efficient way possible. And if you look at China, if you look at Japan, in the 1980s, when people thought Japan was taking over the world, they all had hugely inefficient capital markets that were bad at funding innovation and funded things in a very inefficient manner. And the U.S., despite all of its flaws and despite the ups and downs of business cycles, has been far more effective than almost anyone at deploying capital in a way that promotes innovation.
I think it's really well said. Some in some of your writings and some of the interviews that I've seen, you are stressing to American corporations to keep an eye on the chip war. Why are you saying that, sir?
Well, I think almost every company, if you'd asked them 5 years ago what to expect when it comes to new politicization of tech tensions, almost every company would have been surprised by the scale of new restrictions that's come both from the U.S. and from China over the last couple of years. And companies would like this to stop, but I think it's going to continue. And every company, there's not a single company that isn't exposed to U.S., China, Taiwan tensions, because every company relies on the semiconductors that are produced by Taiwan. And most companies don't have an answer at all to the question of what would you do in case of a worst case scenario.
Okay, we're at the part of the podcast now where I have 5 words that I've come up with, and then you react to those 5 words any way you see fit. It could be a word, a sentence, a thought, a paragraph. So let's start with 2 words, Soviet Union.
I think it was a country that invested lots and lots of money, had lots and lots of bright scientists, but couldn't produce technological progress.
Why do you think that is? The culture?
They didn't. No, I think they didn't have the marketplace to put dollars towards the right uses.
Okay, so just bad capital allocation as a result of communism or their marketplace and the philosophy around it.
That's right.
Okay. United States.
And the innovation superpower it is today. We see it with generative AI, and it has been for many decades.
China.
I think when it comes to tech, China is overestimated. I think people look at big Chinese tech companies like Tencent or Alibaba, which are certainly impressive companies, but they're also companies that have made most of their money in a protected domestic market. And when you look at Chinese firms competing in the tech sector internationally, they've done far less well relative to U.S. firms.
In 1987, Ronald Reagan said to tear down the wall. It's 36 years ago this week he made that speech. And people scoffed at him in the State Department, said that was ridiculous. And he called the Soviet Union the evil empire. He said it was going to end up on the ash heap of history. 2 years after he made that speech, and 2 months or 2 years, let's do the math, it was November of 1989, so let's call it 2 years and 5 months, the Berlin Wall came down. Shortly thereafter, the Soviet Union collapsed. And so people were in disbelief about that. And by the way, I had a professor when I was at Tufts by the name of Holtzman. He studied the Soviet economy. He was an analyst that supplied information to the CIA. And he was talking about 50-year plans for the Soviet economy when I was at Tufts in the 1980s. And so none of that happened. The Soviet Union imploded and so forth. And you mentioned Japan. When I got out of school, we said Japan Inc. It was going to take over everything. They were buying Rockefeller Center at the time. We said, okay, this is going to be a nightmare. And now we're worried about China. Is there a contrarian view out there that China is fairly balkanized? There's 7 strong provinces. They're glued together by the Chinese Communist Party, but there's a lot of internal unrest, and there's a lot of people in China that are upset by their lack of personal freedoms and personal liberties. Is there a scenario where we're taken off guard, or we're taken aback, I should say, by what happens to China over the next decade?
You know, it's certainly possible. I think, though, that the factors that led the Soviet Union to surprise everyone by collapsing were most importantly that the Communist Party collapsed in the Soviet Union. And once the party lost its authority, they couldn't hold the country together. It seems to me the Chinese Communist Party has, if they've learned one lesson, it's not to let their hold on power slip. And so they're going to hold on to power as long as they can. And so long as they do, I don't think China's going to splinter into.
Yeah, and they did pieces. a pretty good job on the 4th of June in 1989 of holding on to power. So if I say the word China, you say what? Superpower? Fragile power?
I think it's an overestimated power.
Overestimated power. Okay. 2 more words, Professor. Taiwan.
Taiwan is a underestimated technological superpower. Most of the world doesn't realize just how extraordinary the capabilities of the Taiwanese are, nor how central the Taiwanese are to the production of all of the electronics that we rely on. The fact that a country of 25 million people can play such an irreplaceable role is really nothing short of extraordinary.
The word semiconductor, sir, my last word.
Well, I think semiconductors are the device that power the world economy. They shape the balance of military power, and they make possible all of the extraordinary advances in computing that we benefit from.
Well, you're terrific to spend time with us today. I greatly appreciate it. What happens next for Chris Miller? What are we working on?
Well, I'm staying busy with semiconductor issues. There's so much in flux right now as companies try to restructure their supply chains, as governments try to build up their own chip industries, that there's plenty to follow in the semiconductor space in the U.S. and Europe and Japan and Taiwan and China as well.
Well, listen, I appreciate your part in this narrative. The title of your book is Chip War: The Fight for the World's Most Critical Technology. And I have to confess something to you. Prior to reading the book, I had some familiarity with Taiwan, but I had no idea the level of technological superpower status that they had. And I do think that your book has raised awareness in the global business community. And so you're doing a great service to everybody. So thank you for that. And I appreciate you being on Open Book today.
Thank you for having me.